Okay, hello. Welcome to the lecture on Plato for this series of online Introduction to Philosophy lectures. Today we'll be talking about Plato's metaphysics and epistemology. So to begin with, let's refresh our memories about what Socrates was interested in, because as you may recall from the last lecture, Plato was the student of Socrates, and he is concerned primarily with developing the views of Socrates into a theoretical account, because you may recall Socrates was not himself so much interested in explaining why the things that he said were true. He was more interested in trying to get people to realize that they did not know what they thought they knew. So let's go ahead and refresh our memory here. This is something that was one of the fundamental claims that Socrates wanted to make, which is that a virtuous person is one who knows what the good is. And that's one of the most important things in our lives, is to figure out how we could actually know what the good is. So Socrates says the virtuous person has a certain kind of knowledge, and Plato wants to understand how we could come to have that kind of knowledge. In other words, he wants to give an epistemology, or a theoretical account of how we come to know the things that we think we do. So what he wants to show in particular is that knowledge of the good is possible. So in order to do that though, you first have to answer the prior question, which is, how do we know anything at all? So if you want to know the good, well, then first you must be able to say what it means to know something in the first place. And then you can go on to give an account of what it means to know the good. So let's start with the more general question, what is knowledge? Now let me ask you a question here. This is a rhetorical question, but just take a second to think about it. So I'm now at LaGuardia College recording this lecture, and I drove here and parked my car out on Skillman Street, where I normally park it. And so now I want to ask you, do I know where my car is? So I'll just give you a second to come up with the answer in your own head. Do I know? Well, arguably, I don't know. For instance, my car may have been towed. I could be standing in here right now, and my car may actually have been in the way of something, and it may have been towed. So I can't say with certainty that I know that my car is out in the lot where I left it. Now, I believe that it's there, and this illustrates an important difference between knowing something and believing that thing. Belief is compatible with the thing that you believe being false. So I might believe that something is true. It might turn out to be false, but I still believe it. It just turns out that I'm mistaken, and my beliefs are mistaken. So knowledge, on the other hand, seems different. We don't say that you know something if there's the chance that you're mistaken about that thing. So knowledge requires certainty. Now Plato interprets this in an epistemological way. So what Plato argues is that if knowledge requires certainty, then the things that we know can't change. Now notice that that's a metaphysical interpretation. The things that are the objects of our knowledge have to be constant. And this makes a kind of intuitive sense. If you want to say that you know something, but that thing is constantly changing, well, as soon as you say something about it, the thing will be different. And so it doesn't seem as though we can say that you have real knowledge of the thing unless that thing remains constant, does not change. But if that's the truth, then the physical world can't be an object of knowledge. And this is where Plato has something in common with the pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus, who we discussed a couple of lectures back. So Heraclitus thought that the physical world was constantly changing, that everything was in flux. Plato agrees with him. The physical world is constantly changing. Even things which seem not to change, like a table or a piece of metal, are undergoing changes, as evidenced by the fact that later on they will decay and go out of existence at the very least. So Plato takes it as kind of definitional of a physical object, that it undergoes change at some point. And if you really take this metaphysical interpretation of knowledge, that you can't know something if that thing is changing, well, it immediately follows that the physical world can't be an object of knowledge. We can't know about the world by, for instance, sensing it. The physical world is that stuff which we have access to via our senses. So we hear, we see, we hear, we taste, we touch, we smell. That's how we know about the physical world in this loose sense of know. But of course, Plato thinks that's not really knowledge, because those things are constantly changing. As Heraclitus put it, these things are in a constant state of flux. Now, if we are to have real knowledge then, the things that we know have got to meet certain requirements. So we've already seen the first requirement that these things must meet. They've got to be unchanging. But of course, if they're unchanging, as we've just sort of run through, things that are unchanging cannot be physical things. And that's just because, as previously just said, Plato takes it as sort of definitionally true of physical objects that they're constantly changing. So whatever it is that's non-changing, is going to be something that's not physical. So if there is real knowledge, and we haven't yet said that there is, but if there is going to be something like real knowledge, Plato thinks that that thing has to be unchanging, and that requires that it be non-physical. Now, of course, that also requires it to be eternal in the sense of being uncreated and undestroyable. And that's just because you may not think about this, but actually being created or being destroyed is a kind of change. So if you don't exist at one point, and then you do exist at the next point, you've undergone a change. You've changed from existing to non-existing, or vice versa, from non-existing to existing. So real knowledge then, the objects of knowledge, must be the kinds of things which are eternal, non-changing, non-physical. Now, if it turns out that there are no such things like that, then Plato will conclude that knowledge really isn't possible. So what he's trying to argue here is, first of all, we need to figure out what it means to say you know something. According to him, to say you know something is to say that you have certainty about that thing. To say that you have certainty about something is to say that that thing cannot change. And if it's true that the thing cannot change, then we can't be talking about anything which is physical, and we can't be talking about things which are created or destroyed. Now again, if there are no such things like that, then we will have to conclude that there is no such thing as knowledge. And that may be one possibility. In epistemology, skepticism is always something that we need to deal with. And this is one way that skepticism could come out to be true. It could be true if there are no eternal, non-physical, unchanging objects which can serve as the appropriate objects of knowledge claims. Now, of course, Plato is not a skeptic. Plato thinks that knowledge is possible. And so he devises a strategy, which is to look somewhere where we already think we know something, and then to model his epistemology, his theory of knowledge, on what's happening in that area. So if you were alive 2,000 years ago, and you were trying to find some certainty, where do you think you would look? Well, hopefully, you were just thinking to yourself, you would think about geometry or mathematics. There doesn't seem to be the possibility that facts about arithmetic, like for instance 2 plus 2 being 4, or 3 plus 5 being 8, those things don't seem to be the kind of things which are candidates for change. Well, that's interesting because remember, we just got through saying that non-changing is, non-changeness is something that's required for real knowledge. And of course, 2 plus 2 being 4 seems to meet that requirement already. It was true in Plato's day. It's true in our day. It was true before you were born. It'll be true after you die. 2 plus 2 being 4 seems to be the kind of thing which has to be true. Or if you don't like arithmetic, just take some basic properties of numbers. The number 2 is prime. The number 2 is even. The number 3 is prime, but odd. So here we are talking about these things. We're saying things about numbers. This number is prime. This number is odd. But numbers don't seem to be the kind of thing which you can discover in the physical world. No one has ever bumped their head on the number 2 hanging off a tree. No one has ever had the square root of 9 fall on their toe as they walk across the lawn. No one has ever stubbed their foot on the Pythagorean theorem. These things don't seem to be the kinds of things which could be physical. And notice, we already have a good reason for believing that these things are non-physical, because we've already discovered that they're unchanging. Now notice what this would mean if you denied it. So if you want to say that 2 plus 2 being 4 is a physical fact about reality, well, then you have to be open to the possibility that it could change at some point. Because remember, every physical thing is something which changes at some point. So if you can accept that 2 plus 2 might someday be equal to 156, then it's perfectly fine to say, excuse me, that was hitting the wrong buttons here. So if you're happy saying that 2 plus 2 could be 156, then it's perfectly fine for you to say, well, this is a physical fact about reality. But Plato is not happy saying that, since he is of the conviction that mathematical truths cannot change. It's impossible for 2 plus 2 to be anything besides 4. It's impossible for the number 2 to be anything besides prime. So they can't be physical objects then. These facts can't be physical facts because they do not change. They are not found in the physical world. But yet we take mathematics very seriously. We don't view it as simply a story that we made up. For instance, to compare this, think about Santa Claus. Now, a bit of a spoiler alert now. There is no Santa. Santa does not exist. So literally speaking, everything we say about Santa Claus is false. Santa Claus is not fat. Santa Claus is not jolly. Santa Claus does not live at the North Pole. Santa Claus does not have elves or reindeers working for him. Now, of course, we can say there's a story that we tell. And in that story, it's true that Santa Claus has these characteristics. So, of course, if someone thought that in the story of Santa, he was a tall, skinny person who was clean-shaven, that person would be mistaken about the story. But notice that's a story. That's not real. But math can't be like that, says Plato. If we want to take this kind of attitude, that numbers don't exist in the physical world and therefore don't exist at all, we end up saying that mathematics is not serious. We end up saying that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is exactly analogous to saying that Santa wears red. It's something we tell a story about. It's just something we made up to pass the time. We were bored one day and we said, hey, let's make up a story. There are these things called numbers, and they work like this and they work like that. Plato doesn't think that that's the way it is. He thinks math tells us about the world. Math tells us when 2 objects have in common, they have in common that there's 2 of them. Now, those 2 objects aren't the number itself because those objects will change, but what they have in common is the number 2. There being 2 of them. And they share that with every group of 2. And every group of 3 shares that, and every group of 4 shares that. So these things, Plato says, they're required in order to take mathematics seriously. And this is a very powerful argument. And we'll see as we go through the course that this pops up over and over again. Plato is a rationalist, and we'll get to this in a second, but he thinks that knowledge is acquired by reason. But then we'll see later that there are people who are empiricists, who think that the senses give us knowledge. But if you think that the senses give us knowledge, then it's up to you to explain how it is that we can have the kind of knowledge that we do, namely mathematical knowledge, which is based merely on the senses. So Plato says, well, look, we can see then that numbers and geometrical shapes exist as non-physical, eternal, and unchanging objects. Now, I didn't really talk about geometrical shapes a second ago, but you can kind of easily see why geometrical shapes would have to be non-physical as well on Plato's view. So, for instance, take some basic facts about geometry. Lines are composed of points. Points have no dimensions. So lines have no dimensions. So when you draw a line on a piece of paper, you're not actually representing the properties that lines are said to have in geometry. Lines don't have width. That's a dimension. But yet, of course, we can't draw a line without drawing something that has width. So everything you see in your geometry textbook, according to Plato, are representations of triangles, not triangles themselves. And this is, of course, a confusion that modern people often make. They look at the picture and they say, that's a triangle. Whereas Plato sees a representation of a triangle, not the actual object itself. So numbers for him exist as non-physical objects, so do shapes. Squares, circles, triangles. These are not physical things. Again, the reasoning is straightforward. If they were physical things, they would change. Then someday it might not be true that circles are those objects where every point on their circumference is equidistant from the center. And that just seems unacceptable to him. Now, so how do we get in touch with these non-physical objects? Well, we get in touch with them by the use of reason. And this is what makes Plato a rationalist. Rationalists are those philosophers who think that knowledge, real knowledge, is acquired by reason and reason alone. So here we see Plato developing a worldview where there are two components to reality. On the one hand, there are the physical elements of reality, tables, chairs, cats, and dogs. And these things have as their properties change and being in flux, coming into being, going out of being, existing for a while in between. They're real, they exist, but also on top of that, there's a non-physical element to reality for Plato, and whereas we get in touch with tables and chairs via our senses, remember we just talked about that, we get in touch with non-physical objects by reasoning about them. And to foreshadow a little bit, what Plato has in mind here is that we're able to use reason to grasp abstract concepts. We'll talk about this shortly, but just to give you a preview, when you talk about dogs, you don't have to talk about any particular dog, Plato says. You can just be talking about the thing which dogs share, the property of being a dog. But you're not there by talking about this dog or that particular dog. You're just talking about all dogs and also no dogs. Now, animals don't seem to be able to do that. My dog doesn't seem to be able to think about what dogs have in common. My dog can be confronted in perception with a particular animal, but is not able to use the commonalities among these animals as a way to form the abstract concept which picks out the thing which all and only dogs share. So we're going to come back to that. Now, this, again, is just to say that real knowledge can only be achieved via the use of reason. And we've already seen, very roughly, Plato's argument for that. The physical world is revealed to us by our senses. The physical world is constantly in flux. In order for us to have knowledge, we must be able to target something which is not in flux. The senses only give us access to things which are in flux. So the senses cannot be sources of knowledge. Only reason, which somehow is going to get us in touch with these unchanging non-physical objects, only that kind of faculty could result in real knowledge, Plato thinks. Now, he has a word for these non-physical objects, and the word that Plato uses is forms. Now, of course, that's not really the word that Plato uses, since Plato is using a Greek word, and the actual Greek word that he's using is eidos. And you should recognize in that Greek word the English word ideas. And that's because they are related to each other. We don't translate the Greek word eidos as idea because it would give modern people the wrong idea. No pun intended. When we modern people think of the word idea, we think of something which is in the mind of the person. We think of something which is in here, in the mind. But of course, Plato's ideas are not in the mind of the person at all. And there's a straightforward reason for thinking that. I know about the number 2. You know about the number 2. She knows about the number 2. we know about the number 2. Now, if that's going to be true, then the number 2 has to be out there. If this chair over here, or this PowerPoint slide objector thing, remote control, only exists in my mind, then you can't get in touch with it. You can't know about it objectively. So Plato thinks the eidos, the forms, the ideas, they don't exist in the mind of any particular person. They exist outside there, out in reality. Now, we get in touch with them in a certain sense by using reason, not by seeing them. You can't see an idea. You can't taste an idea. You can't touch an idea. But you can only think about an idea. The number 2 cannot be seen. It can only be comprehended with our rational faculties. So this is what I just said. Now, of course, they're not located in time or space. And that, again, follows for a sort of very obvious reason. Only physical objects are located at places and at times. So you cannot say that the idea, the number 2, exists at any particular place in the world. Only physical objects exist at locations and at times. So whatever these forms are, they are not located excuse me, they are not located in the world around us. They are outside of the physical realm, in a perfect, eternal, timeless, unchanging, non-physical realm. Now, these ideas, these forms, are graspable by the human mind. And this is the metaphor that Plato uses over and over again. When you understand that the number 2 is even or prime, the mind has grabbed hold of some fact. It has it in its grasp, so to speak. But of course, not its physical grasp, not this way, but with the mind in an analogous kind of way, we're able to understand or comprehend these kinds of eternal and unchanging facts. Something which only humans seem to be capable of doing. Now, why would you think this? Well, one reason's already been given. And that's the following reason. If there is real knowledge, according to Plato, it must be of these unchanging things. We certainly seem to have knowledge of mathematics. So it certainly seems like there are these non-physical things. But of course, most people are not convinced by that, so Plato wants to offer another argument, which through the history of the universe has come to be known as the one over many argument. So here's Plato's basic rough picture. So take this line right here. This line is the dividing line between the physical world down here on the bottom and the non-physical world, which is up here at the top. So here's you over here. Right? And you're making a judgment about these particular objects. So you're saying, you're looking at these objects and you're saying, look, these are trees. Now, ordinarily, you might have thought that what's going on in this case is that you're looking at the tree and coming to have knowledge about it. But Plato's just got through arguing that, well, you can't really say that this is delivered by the senses. There's got to be something else, some aspect that reason is providing. And that's what this is supposed to be symbolizing here. So somehow the mind is able to reach out and grasp the form of tree. Now what's the form of tree? The form of tree is that thing which all and only trees have in common. It's the thing which makes a tree a tree. There's got to be something which all and only trees have in common. That's why they're trees and not, for instance, cows. Human beings are never confused by this, or at least normally functioning ones. Nobody walks into a forest and says, tree, dog, cat, I'm not sure what that is. We can all see that even though this tree will lose its leaves in the winter, and this tree will not, they're both trees. So they've got to share something. They've got to have something in common, which makes it the fact that they're trees. But all the physical properties of trees seem ill-suited to do this job. So, for instance, you might have thought, well, gee, let's see, what makes a tree a tree? Well, they have branches. But, of course, there are things which aren't trees that have branches. Shrubs, for instance. They're not trees, but they have branches. Well, maybe it's that they have bark. Well, some trees have bark. Other trees don't have bark. A barkless tree is still a tree. So the general problem with these physical candidates is that they either are the kinds of things which you could lack and still be a tree. A tree without leaves is still a tree. A tree without bark is still a tree. So you could lack that and still be in the category or class of trees. Or there are things that they share with other items which are not trees. They have sap, so do other plants. They have leaves, so do other plants. So, but yet there must be something. There's got to be something which unites this group. There's got to be one thing which these many objects all have in common. And that's what's pictured here. There's got to be one thing, the essence of tree, which is literally the same in this case as it is in this case. And that being the same accounts for us saying that these are both trees. So now we can see how Plato thinks, well, knowledge is acquired here. You can know that those are trees, but you know it not because you see that they're trees, but because you grasp with the mind the thing which they share. Now notice, this is something that a parakeet or a dog can't do. A dog cannot see what these things and those things have in common. In other words, a dog can't know that they're both trees. Even if animals are capable of having a certain kind of visual experience. You take a dog into the forest and we can assume it sees green, it sees brown things with certain shapes, although that's already reading a lot into what animals can do. Well, just grant it. So they have those visual experiences, but the dog can't know that those are trees that it's seeing because it has no way of understanding what it is that those things have in common, which, for instance, the grass lacks. They just can't do that. So in order to really know that it's a tree, you have to grasp this commonality. The commonality doesn't seem to be something which is physical, so the commonality must be something which is non-physical. Now, of course, the point is even more obvious when we think about other kinds of properties, and we'll get to that in just a second. But here's what we just were talking about put into some words. So we certainly categorize certain objects into groups, like, for instance, male. I'm a male. Perhaps you're not. Perhaps you are. But there's got to be some basis on which we make that decision. The basis is the property which makes that object be the kind of thing that it is. So Plato says, look, for every way that there is of having a group, there's a form which explains why that group exists. The objects must all have something in common, or why else would we put them in that group? So there's the form of human being, the form of male, the form of female, the form of right-handed, the form of blue-eyed, the form of dog, the form of cat, the form of male dog, etc., etc., etc. Now clearly, my dog, that's male, and I share a property. We're both males. So we have some relation to that form. But of course, I'm a human and the dog's a dog. So in that respect, we're different. We don't share those forms. Now again, a key thing that's pushing Plato here is that there doesn't seem to be anything which is physically in common between these objects. Or if there is something which is physically in common, it's the kind of thing which isn't essential to being that property. So for instance, the dog and I both have skin. The dog and I both have hair. But nobody wants to say that having skin or having hair is what makes a dog, or what makes a human. So, when you see that an object is a desk, Plato says you're grasping the form of that object. Ah, I understand that that's a desk. That's how I know that it's a desk. Not just merely by seeing it, but by applying this concept to it, by seeing with the mind what it is that makes it that way. Now, objects are said to participate in their forms. That's a technical term in Plato's philosophy. And nobody is really sure what Plato meant by participation. But we are going to be basically understanding the term participation as resemblance. And there's some support for this in Plato's own work, although he's kind of equivocal. He's not really clear about what it is that he means by the word participate. So I participate in the form of human. I don't participate in the form of dog. I participate in the form of blue-eyed. I don't participate in the form of brown-eyed, etc., and etc. So participation can be understood as a kind of resemblance. So for instance, this screen behind me participates in the form of blueness. That's why it's blue. That's what explains, for Plato, why the screen looks blue to you. Because it resembles the ideal perfect blue, the essential property of being blue. And again, it's sort of obvious that many different kinds of physical things can be blue. This screen, a house, a sunset, a book. But what do those things all have in common? There doesn't seem to be anything except that they're all blue. Very different kinds of objects. A house may be made of wood, made of concrete. A book made of paper. A shirt made of cotton. A screen made of patterns of light, etc. So clearly blue things must share something, otherwise they wouldn't be blue. Doesn't seem like there's any physical thing we can say they share. Nothing seems the appropriate kind of thing, which we could say, that's what they all have in common, except that they capture or resemble the perfect form of blue. An object, like I've just been trying to illustrate, can participate in many forms at once. So the relationship between objects and forms is one to many. One object can participate in many different forms. So let's go ahead and give an example of this. Here we have Scarlett Johansson. Here we have Brad Pitt. Here we have Adriana Lima, Victoria's Secret model. And here we have Ugly Betty. Now, I just picked Ugly Betty because her name is ugly. So I'm not going to be trying to make any aesthetic claims about whether this is right or not, but it's hard to find someone that you can use as an example of this. Okay, so these objects here all share various attributes. For instance, we can say that they're all human. Scarlett is a human, Brad is a human, Adriana is a human, and Betty is a human. Now, only one of these objects, let's just take these at face value, only one of these objects is male. So Brad Pitt is male. The rest are female. Now, of course, we can also say there's the form of beautiful. And according to the way I've set things up, Adriana is beautiful, Brad is beautiful, and Scarlett is beautiful, but Betty is not. Now, again, let me just emphasize that I'm not trying to say this is correct. This is just Plato's view. The things which are beautiful because of their relationship to the perfect form of beauty, which I just have abstractly represented as this nice sunset here. Now, of course, we may come to find out that Adriana really is not beautiful. Our standards may be off, or we may be incorrect about that. And maybe this line here should actually be traced back over to Betty. So maybe Betty is beautiful, because we might come to find that our criteria of beauty is wrong. But Plato is committed to the claim that beauty is an objective, mind-independent property. Some things can be beautiful, other things cannot be beautiful in an objective way. So that there is an objective answer to the question, which one of these objects is beautiful? That's why I chose Ugly Betty, which is what I say. And her name is Ugly Betty. So it's just a way of illustrating this point. So now notice that one particular object, like Adriana, is participating in 1, 2, 3 forms. And there are many more as well. Form of brunette, for instance. She's probably right-handed. I'm not exactly sure which hand that she uses. So there are many forms that objects participate in. My dog is participating in the form of dog, in the form of male, in the form of mammal, and etc., and etc., and etc. So this is Plato's view. There's one form for each group of objects, and that form is thought of as an essential property, the thing which makes the object the kind of object that it is. So in a way, you can think back to our discussion of to our discussion of Socrates in the Euthyphro question. And in that discussion, we saw Socrates looking for definitions of things. What is it that these things share, which all and only these things share, which is responsible for their being that way? And here we see Plato, in essence, taking that idea and turning it into the forms. Here we have the form of male, here we have the form of female, here we have the form of the beautiful, and these things are literally the kinds of things that Socrates was interested in, taken and given ontological reality. They become metaphysical items for Plato. They exist. They aren't merely in the mind. These things are out there, eternal, unchanging, always and perfectly the way they are. Whereas these particular physical objects are changing. Scarlett will not always be this pretty. Brad will not always be that handsome. But the form of beauty will always and eternally be exactly the way that it is. It never changes. As opposed to these physical items down here, which are in flux. So there's again this split between the non-physical world and the physical world, with the relation of participation between them. Okay, so what we've just seen is a summary of the arguments for Plato's view. So we need to talk now about the way he encapsulates these views. Talk about the divided line, which is Plato's way of summing up his views in a nice and handy representation. And this is the way that he would have presented his work to people who were studying philosophy, such as you. Okay? So now in his famous book, The Republic, he lays this out and he gives us this kind of way of representing this thing. So we are to take a line and divide it unevenly into two portions. And actually, it turns out that there are exact proportions that we're supposed to be using here. And so I've represented it that way. Now you take this line and you divide it again into two halves. And what you get is a line which looks like this. Now, all of this is going to be representing something. So on one side of the line, there are the metaphysical items. So over here, what we have are the things which are real. On this side of the line, we have the state of mind of a person who's in contact with these things. So remember at the beginning of these lectures, metaphysics and epistemology are like two sides of a coin. On one side, you have us and the way we contact reality. On the other side, you have reality as it is. So that's represented on these two sides of the line. Now, of course, this main dividing part right here, this very thick line, represents the difference between, on the one hand, the intelligible world, which is the world of eternal non-physical objects, and then down here, at the bottom, we have the visible world. So this line right here, above, are intelligible things, non-physical things, and below it are the visible things, which we're using to stand for things which can be seen, obviously, but also smelled, tasted, heard, and touched. The basic world around us in physical terms. So on one side of the line, those things which are real, non-physical things are real, physical things are real. Plato is not someone who thinks the physical world doesn't exist. He is not someone like Parmenides, who thinks that the world is somehow an illusion and we're wrong about the way it works. Plato thinks the physical world is a real thing. It's out there. But of course, on top of that, there's all this non-physical stuff. Okay, now on the other side, the main division in the line corresponds to whether you have knowledge or opinion. Now notice, this is something that's going to be throwing us off quite a bit here. When we use the word opinion, we're not using an English word. We're using a Greek word which has been translated into an English word. So opinion for Plato is simply the state of mind that someone is in when they are in touch with the visible world through their senses. It is merely the way that we come into contact with the world through our senses. So the dog has an opinion about the table. A person who isn't thinking in terms of abstract knowledge also has an opinion about the table. That simply means that they're in touch with some physical object via the senses and are not applying any of their rational faculties at that moment, if they have them, unlike dog. Okay, so let's start at the lowest level of the line. We're going to be clearly working our way from here, coming up through here. So at the lowest level of the line are images. For instance, pictures, shadows, reflections in a mirror, photographs. Of course, Plato wouldn't have known about photographs, but statues, images. And when you are looking at an image, and when you mistake that image for the real thing, Plato says the state of mind that you're in is imagination. Imagination here is not, see, when we modern people use the word imagination, we mean something very particular. What we mean is, you picture it in your mind or something like that. But that's not what Plato means. When Plato says that someone is imagining something, he means something very specific. That person is in contact with an image and has mistaken that image for the real object. Now, how could that be? Well, let me give you a couple examples of how someone could be imagining in this sense. Suppose that you're in the bathroom. You're looking in the mirror. And you point at the mirror. And you say, that's me. And you point at the image. Well, in that case, Plato says, you'd be imagining. That's not you in the mirror. That's an image of you. It's a reflection of you. That's not the real you. There's a big difference between the image in the mirror and the actual you. Now, of course, the image is a good guide for you, but it would be a mistake to think that that image was actually you. Now, children make this mistake all the time. This is a kind of well-known fact about children, that before a certain age, if you show them a picture of their favorite toy, for instance, say, the kid really likes toy trucks or toy ducks or whatever, and you show them a picture of a toy duck. Well, lo and behold, what we find out is that kids that are very young actually try to reach into the picture and grab the toy duck. They say, my duck. And they reach for it. Of course, that's not the duck. It's a picture of a duck. That kid is imagining, not doing something else. So that's imagination. When you're looking at a picture and you think that that's really the thing that's pictured. Right? That's the real duck. Now, of course, you could also make this mistake if you're watching television. Barack Obama comes on and makes a speech, and you point at the television, and you say, that's Barack Obama. Now, of course, you're wrong about that. That is not Barack Obama. That's a picture of Barack Obama. It's an image of Barack Obama. Notice, if you make this kind of confusion, you'll be led to ask some silly questions. Like, for instance, if you really think that that is Barack Obama, then you might wonder how he got to be so small so as to fit inside the television. But of course, that's a nonsensical question, because Barack Obama is not inside the television. He's at some White House press conference room where there are cameras which are broadcasting his image to your screen. So, now again, you can use the image as a reliable guide for what Barack Obama is saying and doing, and etc., but you shouldn't confuse the image with the person itself. Now, one final way that you can confuse an image with the thing itself. There's a very famous painting of a pipe. Underneath the pipe is written, "This is not a pipe." Now, of course, people saw this, and they sort of got mildly annoyed. What do you mean that's not a pipe? It's a pipe. Look, it's got this shape. It's got that thing over there. There's the smoking, whatever it's called. There's the part where you put in and everything. But of course, the point that the person was making was that this is a picture of a pipe. It's not actually a pipe. You can't put anything in this pipe and smoke it. It's just oil arranged on a canvas. So I lied a second ago. One final example of this. So this is sort of recalling the story about Socrates. You don't confuse the reputation that a person has in a society, which is a kind of image, the image of the person as reflected in their peers, with the actual person. So at Socrates' trial, Plato sees them making this mistake. And Socrates actually points it out in his defense, if you've read the Apology. He actually says, look, they say I did this, they say I did this, they believe this of me, they believe that of me, but that doesn't reflect the real me. Don't confuse my reputation, what you guys think about me, as the actual me. I am not my image. So those people would be imagining as well. They're confronted with an image and mistaking the image for the real thing. So there's all sorts of ways that we mistake images for the real objects. And Plato is just here pointing out that that is dangerous. It can lead us to ask wrong questions. It can lead us to execute people who are beneficial to us. So notice, these are all opinions. This is a form of opinion, imagination, when you are looking at an image and mistaking it for the real thing. Okay, let's move up one level on the line. So instead of looking at images now, we're looking at actual sensible objects. We're looking at actual tables and chairs and cats and dogs. We're not looking at a picture of a cat. We're not looking at a picture of a dog. We're looking at the actual physical dog. Now Plato says, when that's happening, and when you think that that's the real thing, then you are doing something that he calls perceiving. Perceiving is the state of mind of a person when they are in touch with an actual physical object, and they make the mistake of thinking that that's all there is to the object. So, for instance, you walk into a room, you point at a desk, say, that's a desk. But you don't take the time to talk about the form of desk, the abstract property of being a desk, the thing that all desks have in common. You are merely referring to the physical item over there and saying, that's the actual desk. That's what makes that thing a desk. Well, you're making a mistake. You are perceiving the desk, but you don't know about the desk. Notice we haven't crossed this line between opinion and knowledge. We haven't crossed the line between those things which are intelligible and those things which are merely visible. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, you move up one step, and Plato says, now we've entered the realm of reasoning, and we were talking on the other side about things which he calls lower forms. Now, there's always been a bit of a conundrum about what it means to talk about the lower forms. But in general, what Plato means is the kinds of things that we've already been talking about. Numbers, mathematical objects, dogs, tables, chairs, and etc. And when you are at this level of the line, you are no longer just merely perceiving the dog, but you are reasoning about the dog, which means that you understand with the, I shouldn't use the word understand, as you'll see in just a second. Understanding goes up here, so I shouldn't be using that word. But you comprehend or somehow grasp with the mind what it is about dogs that makes them dogs. Now the difference between this level and this level has to do with the kind of forms, what Plato calls higher forms and lower forms. So lower forms are just these ordinary kinds of forms. Dogs, tables, chairs. Higher forms are the ones that Plato gave a special place to, like the form of beauty, the form of justice, moral ideals, and etc. So at that level, you've got some understanding. At that level, you're doing something which is pretty key. You're grasping what all just things have in common, what all beautiful things have in common. Now at the top of this line, Plato puts the form of the good. The good occupies a special place in Plato's philosophy. The good, as we'll see, actually plays the role of making all of these things intelligible. So how is it that we're able to even get in touch with these things? According to him, it's because of the role that the good plays. The good is an overarching form. Now notice what he's doing here is building in all the stuff that Socrates talked about. Socrates says The highest goal of a person's life is to figure out what this is, to figure out what the good is, what all good things have in common. And then once one does that, one is in a position to be a virtuous person, one is in a position to live the right kind of life, one is in a position to truly be happy, and none of these things are possible without this kind of knowledge. But of course, we all have to start down here and work our way up to the form of the good. Now, how do you do that, you might ask? Well, Plato has an answer. The way you do that is by studying geometry. Geometry really is, Plato thinks, the first place where people come into face-to-face contact with non-physical, abstract ideals. Thinking geometrically, when you prove some fact about a triangle, you're not just proving it about this triangle, you're proving it about all triangles. And of course, there are two ways to do that. You start first by reasoning about the picture in your book, and then eventually you get to the point where you understand, where you've moved up a level, and you're no longer using the picture as a way of thinking about triangles, but you're able to grasp triangles themselves. A triangle is simply an object, three-sided, whose interior angles have 180 degrees. I don't need a picture in order to fully understand that concept. Now, of course, a picture helps for those people who are not used to thinking this way, but for those people who have spent a lot of time thinking about geometry, the pictures are unnecessary. And that's the goal. That's how you move up, says Plato. You start using physical objects. You start thinking about them. Eventually you come to see what they all have in common, but you're still thinking about the table, using this particular table as a way of thinking about tables. But eventually, you're just able to grasp the concept of table itself without some intermediary. So here's an analogy I like to use often. Think about the game of chess. I hope people still play chess. Chess is a fantastic game. If you don't play, you should learn immediately. It's a great game. So now, chess is a board, played on a board, 64 squares with all these various pieces, a rook, castle, horse, knight, bishop, etc. And you can play the game that way, but of course the board and the pieces are kind of the lazy way of keeping track of something which could be kept track of purely in the mind. So I once had the experience of watching a chess master play 4 different games of chess at the same time. He had his back turned to the audience. He could not see the chessboard. He would stand there and call out his move. Knight to king 7, checkmate. And then he would move to the next one. Rook to pawn 3, etc., and etc. Never looking at the board. Never turning around to see where the pieces were. He was keeping track of the locations of the pieces using his reason alone. You don't need the board to play chess. You don't need the pictures of triangles to think about triangles. And you don't need tables and chairs to think about what tables and chairs are. So that's really, when you get to this level, you're able to do that. Now, of course, when you get up here, Plato says, there's an interesting thing which happens. Not only do you understand mathematics, geometry, justice, politics, ethics, but you're able to see how they all relate together. So someone who has grasped the form of the good has a kind of aha enlightenment moment where they're able to see the interconnections between every body of knowledge. And this is why Plato says in his political philosophy that the ideal ruler for a society would be a philosopher king, someone who had real knowledge of the good, because then that person would not only understand thermodynamics and plate tectonics, but they would understand how that science relates to politics. So they'd be the ideal ruler. Now, of course, this is not a political philosophy class, but that's a very provocative kind of statement that he's making, that what you need to do is train your rulers to grasp abstract principles using geometry and mathematics. And in fact, Plato was so enamored with this idea that when he started his first college, he had inscribed above it, "Let no one enter here who does not understand geometry." He really thought that this was the way which one became acquainted with abstract ideas and the way one moved up this divided line here. Okay, so that's Plato's views about metaphysics and epistemology. Let's talk about the allegory of the cave here, which is nothing new. This is the same information put in a different way. So Plato is not introducing some new theory here. He's not suddenly springing something on us which we haven't talked about already. He is merely saying, you see, the divided line is the way that I explain my views to philosophy students. The allegory of the cave is the way I explain my view to the lay person. So we're really just re-encapsulating the same ideas. Okay, so we're to imagine a cave, and that's what I've depicted here. You'll see my drawings are always very crude. So here's a nice cave, and we're to imagine a person in this cave who has been born in this position. So this person is chained by the neck. They can't move. They're only able to look directly forward. There's a wall in front of them. And in fact, what I don't have represented here, but what should be represented, is that there would be a bunch of people lined up as we go back along the cave there. So it's a whole society of people. All of them are chained by the neck, staring forward. Behind them is a pillar with some fire on it. So that's what that is. That's a bit of fire there. And what's going on is that there are some people in this cave who are holding up clay objects in front of the fire, and these objects are producing shadows on the wall in front of the person. So try to imagine you're chained. You can only look forward. You can't look to the left. You can't look to the right. You can only see straight ahead. You see on the wall in front of you these various shadows, and they're moving in various patterns. You see, star, dog, cat, shape, etc., etc. And these people occupy themselves by trying to figure out the pattern and figure out which one is going to come next. There was 2 dogs and a cat. The next one is going to be the star. The next one will be a square, and etc. So now, of course, this is a very crude way of putting things, but remember Plato is writing and thinking about this stuff 400 years before year 1. So he doesn't have a lot of analogies that he can draw. But if he were alive today, he would probably be talking about some kind of virtual reality, right? These people are stuck in a kind of movie theater type situation where there's things being projected, and those things are not the real objects. Now, of course, these people in this position are going to think that these are the real objects. Now, this is a way of dramatically illustrating what Plato calls imagination. These people are imagining. They're imagining because they're in touch with shadows, images, and they are mistaking those images for the real objects. Now, suppose that someone came and set one of these prisoners free and unchained them and turned them around so that they then saw behind them the objects which were making the shadows. They would come to realize, those things over there, those are not the real objects. The real objects are these things right here. Now, of course, that's Plato's way of dramatizing what he calls perception. These people are now perceiving because they're in touch with physical things. But, of course, these physical things are artifacts, right? In the story, this is a thing that's made out of clay. This isn't a real star. It's some clay star. So they've gone from thinking that these shadows were real to realizing they're merely images. So they moved up to the next level. Now they're looking at these things, but they think those are the real things. So they're still stuck in the cave. And obviously, this line here, the cave line, represents the dividing line on the divided line. The one between knowledge outside the cave and opinion, which is what's going on inside this cave. So now, we imagine this person going up what is described as a jagged, rocky ascent. And this right here is my way of trying to picture that the person is not happy. So I know it looks like he has a mustache or some crazy thing on his face. But it's supposed to illustrate something that Plato thought was true, which is that doing geometry, working your way up out of the cave, thinking about abstract objects is difficult. People don't like it. People, when they first study philosophy, think it's difficult. They think it's hard. And that's because it is difficult. It is hard. And Plato is aware of that. So the getting out of the cave involves this kind of rough, rocky ascent, right? The person's legs are tired, they hurt, they complain, they've been sitting their whole lives, they're like, I hate this. But eventually they get out of the cave, so you're happy again because you're not working anymore, and they come into contact for the first time with real objects. They come into contact for the first time with real objects. See, down here, they merely saw replicas of these objects. Out here, these are the real things. They see the stars, they see trees, they actually see what's going on. But of course, coming from the dark cave into the bright light of the sun is blinding. So at first, people are unable to look directly at the objects and instead focus on shadows of real objects. This is the level of the lower forms. Now, of course, you're out of the cave, so you really do have some knowledge in this case, but it's not of the most important things, the actual tree in this case. It's of this lesser thing, the shadow. Excuse me. So when you're thinking about dogs and tables and chairs, and you recognize what it is that dogs have in common and what it is that tables and chairs have in common, you do have some knowledge. You're out of the cave. But you're looking at things that are somehow less important. Now, once you become acclimatized out here, once your eyes adjust to the light, you're able to look directly at the physical objects themselves. You're able to move to the higher forms. So the tree in here would be the form of justice, for instance, the form of piety, the form of moral properties, and etc. Now, eventually, once you're out here for a while, you're able to turn your attention, focus your gaze on the sun. The sun, it turns out, plays a special role in this world out here. One will come to realize that it's only because the sun emits light that we're able to see anything at all. Without the light of the sun, nothing up there would be visible. Now, of course, this is Plato's way of saying that without the form of the good, which is what the sun represents, the sun in this allegory is the form of the good. The form of the good is a unifying kind of thing. It illuminates the entire landscape. It doesn't just illuminate that part over there or that part over there, right? You can be over here merely looking at this tree, but you might not notice the other things in the background over here. But once you see what the sun is doing, you see, it illuminates this whole landscape. Everything up here is visible because the sun is putting its light out. And that was Plato's way of thinking about the form of the good. The form of the good acts like a kind of sun, in that it makes all of the forms intelligible. If it weren't for the form of the good, Plato thought, then we would never be able to know anything about justice or about what a dog is a dog, why are there dogs, why are there cats. It's only because the form of the good exists that we're able to make any of these kinds of judgments at all. So here we have a story which depicts each level of the cave. Each level of the divided line. We have imagining at the beginning, mistaking images for the real things. We have perception, the next stage, mistaking physical objects for the things outside the cave. We have reasoning. Once you get out of the cave, you're really having some knowledge, but you're not thinking about the most important things. We have understanding, which is coming to grasp things like piety, justice, and so on. And then finally, we have the form of the good, which is acting as a unifying thing, which allows all of these things to be comprehended, to be intelligible. So just a different way of illustrating the same points. Now, of course, there are a couple of aspects of this story which are not found in the divided line. So, for instance, one of the aspects is that at the beginning of this whole story, somebody comes in and frees the prisoner. Now, this is Plato's way of talking about what he thinks education is like. Education, notice, the prisoner, once he's freed, is merely turned around and sees behind him and goes, look at that back there. He's not given a lecture. He's not made to memorize anything. He is rather, his own rational faculties are directed in the right way, and the rest is done by him. And so Plato thinks this is how we educate. You're not supposed to open up the mind and pour a bunch of facts in there, but rather you're supposed to point the mind in the right direction and the intellectual curiosity of the person takes over after that. So education, like Socrates thought, is not about memorization and repeating, but is instead about actively engaging the rational faculty, putting it on the right track, because people are drawn to this, to the form of the good, like a moth is to a light. So the form of the good has this kind of attractive power to it. It's such that humans always want to find it. And this, of course, is of a piece with Socrates' view that no one knowingly does evil, which we mentioned briefly in the last lecture. People do evil out of ignorance. They don't do evil because they want to do evil. They're all aiming at the good, because the good is the natural thing which human beings are interested in achieving. It's just that people make mistakes. They think that something is good when it isn't. Okay, so now, of course, the other thing which is not in the divided line is this rough and rocky ascent. That's not depicted in the line. But of course, what Plato is trying to illustrate to the average person is that philosophy is difficult. Philosophy is hard. People don't enjoy doing it at first. They resist doing it. And of course, one final element of the story is that once the person is out and has got to this point, the person recognizes that they need to go back into the cave and free another slave. They need to free someone else from the world of opinion and guide them up into the realm of knowledge. But of course, after being out in the sunlight of pure reality, going back into the cave, the person's eyes are going to be unadjusted in the other way. They may not be so good at determining which thing comes next. The people down there will laugh. Oh, this person's an idiot. They don't even know that after two cats comes a dog, or whatever pattern they figured out down there. And this, of course, is Plato's way of talking about Socrates. Socrates was often made fun of in his society. He was a raggedy dresser. He didn't care about wealth or fame or money. He was always wearing the same clothes, as we talked about previously, sort of unkempt, hanging out in the marketplace, and people would make fun of him. But of course, what Plato is trying to suggest here is that he was that way because all of this is sort of irrelevant. Socrates was out here. Socrates made it out of the cave. So us mocking him for not being able to do cave activities is to sort of not see what's important about what happened to him. So at the end then of this is a kind of illustration of why it is that philosophers might be thought of as absent-minded professors. Oh, they're idiots. Well, Plato says, no, it's not that they're idiots. It's just that these worldly concerns are irrelevant to them. They've somehow moved up and are dealing with more important things. So that, of course, is not in his divided line.